Alright, welcome to another installment of Gutter Fighting Secrets Martial Arts History. This one's a very obscure topic, but when I got the email from you, Andrew, I really could not resist putting something together about this. You had asked me about what pirates trained in. Did they use martial arts? Did they learn martial arts? Or any form of hand-to-hand combative training? Now, I researched this, and I could not find anything whatsoever that said pirates trained in martial arts or hand-to-hand combatives, like, officially. That's not to say, though, that these guys back in the freaking 16 and 1700s were not doing some form of training. So before we get into all of that and what they may or may not have been training in, I want to give kind of a very brief history of European piracy. I say European piracy because not only, were there the swashbuckling, open shirt wearing, eye patch guys that we think about when we think about pirates and let's walk the plank and freaking pillage and plunder. More so in the Orient and in the Middle East, there were, like the Barbary pirates and Chinese pirates of all, various kinds. But specifically in this video, we're going to be focusing on those European, tricorn hat wearing guys that we think about when we think about pirates. So I mentioned the tricorn hat thing. Yeah, that is kind of how they would look. If you look at pictures back in the day, we don't really have pictures, but if you look at drawings and stuff from, guys back in the day, that is how guys would have dressed, especially the upper class people. They would have had those, long overcoats, brightly colored with the rolled up long cuffs and the shiny buttons, the breeches and the buckled shoes and the long socks, the tricorn hats, even the wigs. That was a big thing. That's definitely how the upper class would have dressed. And if you look at the way it is today, even, so these guys would have come from, quote-unquote, poor or working class background. And they would have definitely been aspiring to be more than they were. Like, as soon as they got money enough to buy these clothes or stole the clothes or whatever, they would have aspired to dress like the upper class. If you look at, gangsters today or whatever, what do they do as soon as they start selling their drugs and making their money? What do they buy? They buy gold chains and, nice watches and, expensive clothes. And that's exactly how it would have been back in the day. They came from a poor background, and as soon as they had the means, they aspired to dress and become more than they were. They aspired to be more than where they come from. So that's definitely how they would have looked. As far as the peg legs and the hooks on the hands and the eye patches, actually, yes, that is kind of a historical accuracy again. Guys going to sea and getting in battles, whether it be privateers, pirates, naval officers, or enlisted men, they got in sword fights, and cannonballs were flying, grape shot, freaking shrapnel from splinters, all kinds of stuff happened, and obviously medical treatment wasn't what it is today. So a lot of the times amputation was a very common thing they would have done. So what happened to get, a freaking gunshot wound in the bottom of the leg or a sword wound and you get your leg taken off, you got to walk around, you're going to need a peg leg. So that's kind of an actually historically accurate thing. The hooks on the hands, yeah, maybe, you get your hand chopped off or something happens. Going to sea is a dangerous occupation even today. I mentioned in one of my videos that I used to be a merchant mariner. I still hold that credential today. It's a dangerous job even in these days, but especially way, way more so back in the day, and shit happens at sea. So to see a guy with an eye patch or a hook on the hand or a peg leg or whatever, it's actually not, it's not historically inaccurate. While I'm on this, the eye patch, another reason guys wore that is for night vision. You close one eye and you put a patch over it all day, and then at night you take that off. You're able to see in the dark. Your eye has already been acclimated to the dark. So that is one reason they may have worn the eye patch. Not even just because they were blind in one eye from a sword cut or whatever. Let's not make this about what pirates would have looked like or the history of pirates. But before I go into what, if anything, they would have trained in as far as hand-to-hand combatives, let me just briefly continue with the history of piracy. And I'll make this short and sweet. So basically, like in the 1600s, nations started developing what were called privateers. And privateers, essentially what that is is like a mercenary on the ocean. Sanctioned pirate. These privateers would have been sanctioned by whatever government, whether it be the Dutch or the French or the English or the Spanish. They were all kind of using them. And it would have been whoever. Like if you had a freaking sloop or a boat or a ship with a crew and they were all down to like go to sea, get in battle, and rob enemy ships, then you could go to your government and say, hey, listen, I've got a boat and a crew here. We're all down for this. Like, what do you need from us? And they would have basically said, well, here's a letter of marque, basically like a license to go be a privateer for a specific period of time or a specific length of campaign or whatever, and they would have given you that, and that would have given you free reign over enemy merchant ships. Navy ships too, probably, but they more than likely would have been attacking merchant ships. If you look at it today with the Somali pirates, right? Well, what kind of ships are they attacking? They're definitely sure as shit not attacking naval ships because they'll be outgunned and outnumbered. But they're attacking merchant ships because, unfortunately, merchant fleets, generally speaking, at least American merchant fleets, are unarmed. We're not allowed to be armed at sea. It's ridiculous. Now, there is a thing called CivMars, or like civilian mariners or whatever, and those are like government ships that transport ammunition and the military equipment and stuff, and those are run by the Navy, but it's still got civilian and merchant mariners crewing the ships. But when you go through that, you still get like small arms training, and you still have to go through like some training or whatever. So those ships generally are armed if you're transporting ammunition or weapons or whatever to like war zones. But we're talking about merchant ships carrying oil or goods or like cargo ships, ro-ros, roll-on, roll-off ships. Now, I know I'm jumping all over the place for a second here, but like, let me just say this: during like the Iraq War, Operation Enduring Freedom or whatever, they were actually in conscripting civilian merchant ships to be used for military service. Those roll-on, roll-off ships I mentioned, they were putting Humvees and helicopters and stuff on them and sending them over to war zones that way. That's been done for a long time. So how do you move an army when you need to get it from point A to point B, especially back in the day? You put it on ships. This was a common thing in World War II, I know, like American merchant ships. A crazy freaking amount of these things went to sea. They call them Liberty ships. But the German submarines would freaking sink them. They knew that this is the way we were transporting our equipment, our manpower, our vehicles, our ammunition, our weapons. We put it mostly all on ships. I mean, what are you going to do? You can't freaking put it on an airplane and just fly it over. That just doesn't make any sense for the most part if you're talking like masses and masses of stuff. Still to this day, the majority of stuff is initially moved by ship. That's always the way it's been. So these privateers would have basically been sanctioned to go after these ships, and in a lot of cases, like what they found on the ships when they robbed it, they could keep. They could keep the ship, they could keep the money. I don't know about the crew. I don't think they kept the crew. I think it was back in the day, especially with the privateering, a little more civil, where they take the ship's company, the ship's crew prisoner, and maybe hopefully they wouldn't kill them all. Hopefully they'd bring them back and put them in a prison, like a military prison, POWs or whatever. But that was basically what a privateer was. Out of this privateering kind of came what we know as piracy, European piracy today. A lot of these pirates, more than likely, would have started out as privateers, and if they weren't starting out as privateers, a lot of them probably had seafaring experience either from the merchant service or the Royal Navy, or just the Navy in general, no matter what country they were from. So in that, I want to speculate that these guys probably had some type of training, and definitely not all these guys. I'm sure it was also common just for criminals to go and join a pirate crew, but for the most part, you kind of had to be in that seafaring class to get into the pirate's crew, right? You had to know how your way around a sailing ship, and let me tell you from personal experience, that's not like just an easy thing to do. Even back in the day, a lot of these sailors that were on sailing ships, there was hierarchy of sailors. Like the top men worked aloft in the sails, and then there were guys that didn't really go up aloft much, and they just did crap on the decks, and this is more for the Royal Navy and whatever, but the Royal Navy was conscripting sailors for a long time. Like in a time of war, they would impress sailors into the Navy. Not impress them like, hey, we're badass. Like press them into service. And so they did this, and they liked to mostly take merchant sailors because they knew what they were doing. But they also took landlubbers, landsmen, and put them in the ships. And these guys, it takes a while to figure out what you're doing as far as all the halyards and ropes and freaking sails, and this is the topmast, and this is the foretop, this is the halyard, the royal freaking foretop, mizzen top. It's been a while, but it takes a while to learn the ropes, basically. So, in order for someone to join a pirate's crew, they more than likely would have had seafaring experience to begin with, and more than likely would have gotten that from either privateering or the Navy, Royal Navy, or at least merchant service. But if you're going to go and become a pirate, probably you've had some seafaring fighting experience, as well as just a general loathing of the system in general. Getting on with the point of the video, I'm going to speculate that a lot of these guys came from the naval service, or at least something like that, and they would have had an understanding of drilling and the importance of drilling with a cutlass, the importance of drilling to some degree with different weaponry. It's kind of a known fact that for the most part what they used on the high seas to fight each other were cutlasses. Obviously they used the pistols and the flintlock rifles, or flintlock freaking muskets or whatever as well. To a lesser degree, I know they used boarding axes, things like pikes, which were used for like shoving off from another boat or whatever. They didn't really so much use those as weapons, I don't think, but hell, they could have, and it probably would make a decent weapon. Other things like daggers and knives, but cutlasses were kind of the go-to thing. And the Royal Navy definitely drilled with cutlasses. I don't know exactly when they started drilling with cutlasses. I've heard actually not until like the late 1700s, early 1800s, but I've also read, other accounts where it probably was a little bit before that they officially started drilling with cutlasses. And they had, training on how to use a cutlass. You don't necessarily just pick up a cutlass and then you know how to fight, because if the other guys trained on it, well then you're in a disadvantage. So yeah, they definitely were training with swords. They definitely, and I'm sure the pirates, I don't think they probably had a very organized official way of doing it, but you never know. They may have had every now and again some practice with cutlasses, and either taking the wooden cutlasses out and train that way, or just whatever. Now, another thing that you might have seen is obviously like boxing. Boxing's been around for a long time. I'm almost sure that like one of the first documented European boxing matches was in 1681 or something like that. So it's been around, and they may have very well had some experience or quote-unquote training with boxing. Whether or not this was a thing, I don't think that they drilled boxing in the Royal Navy or really anywhere else. But I'm assuming that since it was around and it was known, they probably had guys who knew about it. And to say that they might have boxed or done something like that it's not out of the question. They certainly could have. Another thing that you may have seen is wrestling. I mean, look, wrestling's been around since the freaking Greeks and before that, since the freaking Sumerians or whatever. It's not out of the question, again, that some of these guys had learned wrestling. Maybe they trained their other guys in wrestling. Now, this is all speculation on my part, but I'm just going back historically speaking and looking what was around at that time period. Boxing and wrestling have been freaking the way of combatives since from a long time, especially for the Europeans. And to say that these pirates may or may not, or some of them may or may not have learned boxing and or wrestling is not necessarily out of the question. But again, it's speculation. I have no idea. It is fairly safe bet to say that they would have had some experience with fencing, or at least drilling with cutlasses. Even just growing up, you would have probably learned some stuff about sword fighting. The way that we carry guns here in the States these days is a lot like how they would have carried swords back in the day. It was your pistol. It was your CCW. I don't really know all the legalities back then. I think swords were a lot more common than a CCW is today. But Again, I don't know the legalities and really the history of it, but I know it was very freaking common to carry a sword. And I know fencing was a very common art to have studied, especially for the aristocracy and the higher class, but I'm sure that everybody had a basic understanding about how to utilize that weapon. Now, as far as fencing goes, obviously it can translate into knife work as well. I'm sure they had, an understanding about the vital areas to strike with a knife, and kind of the stance and all that. I'm sure it was not really a very officially organized thing, but these guys probably would have known their way around basically how to do some fencing and fight with a knife, and probably some unarmed combat as well. People were tougher back then. People just fought a lot more. It wasn't an uncommon thing to have to protect yourself and defend yourself. So people grew up fighting a lot more so than they do today. So to say what kind of training they had is not necessarily the right question, but more so how much experience they would have had. And assuming like these pirates, a lot of them were kind of the dregs of society, outcasts, just criminals in general. So they probably would have fought quite a bit. They probably, a lot like the criminals of today, grew up fighting in some respect and were able to get proficient at it just from experience. Now, pirates like freaking Blackbeard and all that, those guys were just nutty crazy, and I know they enjoyed violence quite a lot. They were psychopathic about it. They would torture the heck out of guys and really get down and dirty with it, and they loved it. But that's the reality of piracy. If we're gonna tie it in today, the Somali pirates that are so famous, and we hear about them attacking our merchant fleet and whatever. These guys, generally speaking, probably don't have much training. In fact, I've spoken with some merchant guys that I have known over the years. One of these guys was on what was the name of that ship? It was on the Maersk, Alabama, I believe. And this guy was basically saying that he had the opportunity to put a knife. I'm going to just say it. He put a knife to one of the guys, the Somali pirates, during that whole thing, and the guy froze up. He didn't know what to do. Basically, what he was saying was these guys weren't trained killers. They were probably killers, yes, but not trained. I'm pretty sure that these Somali pirates, they're either mercenaries, child soldiers, or just freaking poor fishermen that grab an AK. It's easy to get. I think it's like $20 over there. You grab an AK, you go, get some RPGs, throw them in a boat. That's the type of individual, more like a pirate, not an organized, trained soldier or a trained, professional. More so just a criminal who wants to get some money and is going to go to attack a ship and take what they got and kill whoever they have to. Same thing back in the day. It wasn't necessarily a trained organization or a trained naval force or a trained soldier or whatever. It was just freaking criminals. They knew how to sail a ship. All right, let's go attack some people. Let's get some cannons. Let's get some cutlasses and some flintlocks and go and take what they got. I did mention about like the Royal Navy, for example, and this is mostly what I was able to research is the Royal Navy. They did have cutlass drills. They did have actually a little bit of wrestling. They would have wrestled a little bit. It was just necessary. Obviously, back then, boarding parties and everything, that's how naval warfare was fought. It was fought initially with cannons. Then you close distance. You board the enemy ship. You get right next to it. And you finish the job with freaking cutlasses and knives and flintlocks. And bayonets. And this brings me to another thing. Is the Marine Corps, the Royal Marine Corps. These guys were founded, I forget the exact date, but it's not important. These guys were founded to be put on the ships as a special naval force, only on the ships. Their duties were like sentry duty on the ship, maintaining discipline, and then during combat, naval combat, they would go up to the tops, up in the freaking sails and shoot down. They were sharpshooters. They were used specifically for amphibious warfare. So they would have obviously been training a lot, and things like bayonet drills, cutlass drills, and probably to some degree, unarmed combat as well. So bayonets were another thing. I'm sure they existed, and I'm sure pirates utilized them, if they had them. So to say that they may have been training and doing some bayonet drills, which were very common back in the day. It's probably not an unlikely thing. So bayonet drills, cutlass drills, some knife fencing or whatever, perhaps some boxing. Definitely in the Royal Navy there was wrestling, and that's kind of, in my opinion, what they would have been doing. You may have not needed me to say all that, but that's my research is telling me that these are these things that these people would have been training in, and the pirates more than likely would have just been growing up as criminals, learning from experience, how to fight and whatever, how to fight dirty, and grabbing cutlass and go, and let's kill some people and get their money. So that's my research as far as what pirates would have used for martial arts. That my research told me that some of these guys going over to the Orient, right? They may have in fact actually learned some Oriental martial arts from over there. It's just speculation, not on my part, but speculation from what I've heard. But it's not an uncommon thing, maybe, that these guys would have met some Oriental people and seen some kung fu or whatever, and picked some up along the way. You never know, but it could have happened. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. I don't really have too much more to say about it, and I'm not going to meander and ramble on about it. But the fact that they would have probably had some fencing, maybe some boxing and some wrestling, and then, obviously bayonets, and then they probably would have at least trained on how to freaking, load a flintlock and whatever as well along the way. That's probably the hand-to-hand combat that they would have been learning about or grown up learning about. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Andrew, thanks for the question, bro. I could not pass this up to do this. I really kind of enjoyed doing my research. I wish I could have found more, but it's tough, and I'm not the type of guy that sits well in like a library and I can scour through old documents and books. Like, maybe if I had done that, I would have found a little bit more for you, but I do enjoy reading about this stuff, and from my research over the years, and then specifically what I learned doing the research for this small video is, just that's probably what they would have been doing. Guys, I appreciate you watching, checking this out. It's kind of a unique video, pirate martial arts, but you know what? Everybody loves pirates and everybody loves martial arts, so there you go, great mix. Until next time, guys, please remember that you are your first and last line of defense, and I will see you all on the next video. Cheers, mother flowers.